2. Prison Talk. Interviewer J.J. Brochier. One of the concerns of discipline and punish is to criticize certain blank areas in historical studies. You remark, for instance, that no one has ever written, or even thought of writing, the history of the practice of examining. This is hard to believe. Foucault. Historians, like philosophers and literary historians, have been accustomed to a history which takes in only the summits, the great events. But today, unlike the others, historians are becoming more willing to handle ignoble materials. The emergence of this plebeian element in history dates back 50 years or more. This means that I have fewer problems about talking to historians. You would never hear a historian say what someone or other wrote about Buffon and Ricardo in an incredible journal called Raison Présente. Foucault concerns himself only with mediocrities. Interviewer. In your study of the prisons, you seem to regret the absence of a certain kind of source material, of monographs on particular prisons, for instance. Foucault. At the moment, people are returning increasingly to the monograph form, but no longer so much in terms of studying a particular object as of rendering apparent the point at which a certain type of discourse is produced and formed. What would it signify today to write a study of a particular prison or psychiatric hospital? Hundreds of such studies were written in the 19th century, mostly of hospitals, dealing with the histories of the institutions, chronologies of their directors, and so forth. Today, writing a monograph history of a hospital would involve making the whole archive of the hospital emerge in the movement of its formation as a discourse in the process of constituting itself, and interacting at the same time with the development of the hospital and its institutions, inflecting and reforming them. What one would thus try to reconstitute would be the enmeshing of a discourse in the historical process, rather on the lines of what Fay has done with totalitarian discourse. Establishing a corpus of source data does indeed pose a problem for my research, but this is undoubtedly a different problem from the one encountered in linguistics, for example. With linguistic or mythological investigations, it is first necessary to take a certain corpus, define it, and establish its criteria of constitution. In the much more fluid area that I am studying, the corpus is in a sense undefined. It will never be possible to constitute the ensemble of discourses on madness as a unity, even by restricting oneself to a given country or period. With the prisons, there would be no sense in limiting oneself to discourses about prisons. Just as important are the discourses which arise within the prison, the decisions and regulations which are among its constitutive elements, its means of functioning, along with its strategies, its covert discourses and ruses which are not ultimately played by any particular person, but which are nonetheless lived, and assure the permanence and functioning of the institution. All of this has to be brought together and made visible by the historian, and in my view, this task consists rather in making all these discourses visible in their strategic connections than in constituting them as unities to the exclusion of all other forms of discourse. Interviewer. You determine one moment as being central in the history of repression, the transition from the inflicting of penalties to the imposition of surveillance. Foucault. That's correct. The moment where it became understood that it was more efficient and profitable in terms of the economy of power to place people under surveillance than to subject them to some exemplary penalty. This moment in time corresponds to the formation, gradual in some respects and rapid in others, of a new mode of exercise of power in the 18th and early 19th centuries. We all know about the great upheavals, the institutional changes which constitute a change of political regime, the way in which the delegation of power right to the top of the state system is modified. But in thinking of the mechanisms of power, I am thinking rather of its capillary form of existence, the point where power reaches into the very grain of individuals, touches their bodies, and inserts itself into their actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes, and everyday lives. The 18th century invented, so to speak, a synaptic regime of power, a regime of its exercise within the social body rather than from above it. The change in official forms of political power was linked to this process, but only via intervening shifts and displacements. This more or less coherent modification in the small-scale modes of exercise of power was made possible only by a fundamental structural change. It was the instituting of this new local capillary form of power which impelled society to eliminate certain elements such as the court and the king. The mythology of the sovereign was no longer possible once a certain kind of power was being exercised within the social body. The sovereign then became a fantastic personage, at once archaic and monstrous. Thus, there is a certain correlation between the two processes, global and local, but not an absolute one. In England, the same capillary modification of power occurred as in France. But there the person of the king, for example, was displaced within the system of political representations, rather than eliminated. Hence one can't say that the change at the capillary level of power is absolutely tied to institutional changes at the level of the centralized forms of the state. Interviewer: You show that as soon as the prison was constituted in its form as surveillance, it began to secrete its own raw material, namely delinquents. Foucault: My hypothesis is that the prison was linked from its beginning to a project for the transformation of individuals. People tend to suppose that the prison was a kind of refuse dump for criminals, a dump whose disadvantages became apparent during use, giving rise to the conviction that the prisons must be reformed and made into means of transforming individuals. But this is not true. Such texts, programs, and statements of intention were there from the beginning. The prison was meant to be an instrument comparable with, and no less perfect than, the school, the barracks, or the hospital, acting with precision upon its individual subjects. The failure of the project was immediate, and was realized virtually from the start. In 1820, it was already understood that the prisons, far from transforming criminals into honest citizens, serve only to manufacture new criminals, and to drive existing criminals even deeper into criminality. It was then that there took place, as always in the mechanics of power, a strategic utilization of what had been experienced as a drawback. Prisons manufactured delinquents, but delinquents turned out to be useful in the economic domain as much as the political. Criminals come in handy. For example, because of the profits that can be made out of the exploitation of sexual pleasure, we find the establishment in the 19th century of the great prostitution business, which was possible only thanks to the delinquents who served as the medium for the capitalization of everyday, paid-for sexual pleasure. Another example. Everyone knows that Napoleon III was able to seize power only with the help of a group consisting, at least on its lower levels, of common law criminals, and one only needs to see the workers' fear and hatred of criminals during the 19th century to understand that the criminals were being used against them in social and political struggles as agents of surveillance and infiltration, preventing and breaking strikes, and so forth. Interviewer: So the Americans in the 20th century weren't the first to use the mafia for this sort of job? Foucault: Absolutely not. Interviewer: There was the problem of penal labor as well. Workers feared the undermining of their wages by competition from cheap prison labor. Foucault: Perhaps. But I wonder whether the issue of penal labor was not orchestrated precisely so as to constitute this hostility between delinquents and workers which was of such importance for the general workings of the system. What worried the bourgeoisie was the kind of amiable, tolerated illegality that was known in the 18th century. One should be careful not to exaggerate this. Criminal punishments in the 18th century were of great ferocity. But it is nonetheless true that criminals, certain of them at least, were perfectly tolerated by the population. There was no autonomous criminal class. A man like Mondron was received wherever he went by bourgeoisie and aristocracy as well as peasantry, and protected by all. But once capitalism had physically entrusted wealth in the form of raw materials and means of production to popular hands, it became absolutely essential to protect this wealth, because industrial society requires that wealth be directly in the hands not of its owners but of those whose labor, by putting that wealth to work, enables a profit to be made from it. How is this wealth to be protected? By a rigorous morality, of course. hence the formidable layer of moralization deposited on the 19th century population. Look at the immense campaigns to Christianize the workers during this period. It was absolutely necessary to constitute the populace as a moral subject and to break its commerce with criminality, and hence to segregate the delinquents and to show them to be dangerous not only for the rich, but for the poor as well, vice-ridden instigators of the gravest social perils. Hence also the birth of detective literature and the importance of the faits divers, the horrific newspaper crime stories. Interviewer: You show that the poorer classes were the principal victims of crime. Foucault: And the more they were its victims, the more they feared it. Interviewer: But criminals were recruited from among these classes. Foucault: Yes, and the prisons were the great instrument of recruitment. The moment someone went to prison, a mechanism came into operation that stripped him of his civil status, and when he came out he could do nothing except become a criminal once again. He inevitably fell into the hands of a system which made him either a pimp, a policeman, or an informer. Prison professionalized people. Instead of having nomadic bands of robbers, often of great ferocity, roaming about the countryside as in the 18th century, one had this closed milieu of delinquency, thoroughly structured by the police, an essentially urban milieu, and one whose political and economic value was far from negligible. Interviewer: You rightly remark that penal labor has the peculiarity of being useless. One wonders then what its role can be in the general economy. Foucault: As it was initially conceived, penal labor was an apprenticeship not so much in this or that trade as in the virtues of labor itself. Pointless work, work for work's sake, was intended to shape individuals into the image of the ideal laborer. It was a chimera, perhaps, but one which had been perfectly worked out and defined by the American Quakers, with the founding of the workhouses and by the Dutch. But then from the late 1830s, it became clear that in fact the aim was not to retrain delinquents, to make them virtuous, but to regroup them within a clearly demarcated, card-indexed milieu, which could serve as a tool for economic or political ends. The problem thereafter was not to teach the prisoners something, but rather to teach them nothing, so as to make sure that they could do nothing when they came out of prison. The feudal character of penal labor, which was linked initially to a didactic plan, now came to serve a different strategy. Interviewer: Don't you find it striking that today people are returning from the schema of crime as delinquency to crime as an infraction, an illegality, reversing, that is, the course taken in the 18th century? Foucault: I believe that the great intolerance of the population for the delinquent, which the morality and politics of the 19th century set out to establish, is in fact now being eroded. Certain forms of illegality or irregularity are becoming more and more accepted, not just those which were previously tolerated and accepted, such as fiscal and financial irregularities, things which the bourgeoisie had been able to get along with on the best of terms, but also the sort of irregularity that consists, for example, in stealing something from a shop. Interviewer: But isn't it because everyone has got to know about the first kind of irregularities, the fiscal and financial ones, that the general attitude to minor irregularities has changed? Some time ago, Le Monde published statistics comparing the considerable economic damage caused by the first kind of offenses and the small number of months or years of imprisonment with which they were punished, and the small amount of economic damage caused by the other sort of offenses, including violent crimes such as hold-ups, and the substantial number of years of prison given the offenders. The article expressed a sense of scandal at this disparity. Foucault: This is a delicate issue, one which is currently under discussion among the ex-prisoners groups. It is quite true that in popular consciousness and also in the present economic system, a certain margin of illegality is not seen as a serious problem, but rather as perfectly tolerable. In America, people know that holdups are a permanent business risk for big stores. They work out roughly what it costs and find that the cost of an effective surveillance and security system would be too high, and thus uneconomical. They leave things as they are. The insurance pays for it, it's all just part of the system. Regarding this sort of illegality, which seems to be spreading, are we dealing with a questioning of the line of demarcation between tolerated breaches of the law and serious crimes? Or is this not rather a simple relaxation on the part of the system which, aware of its own solidity, can afford to accept at its margins something which after all poses absolutely no threat to it? There has also clearly been a change in people's attitude to wealth. The bourgeoisie no longer has that proprietorial attitude to wealth which it had in the 19th century. Wealth is no longer what one possesses, but what one makes a profit out of. The accelerating flow of wealth, its ever-growing power of circulation, the abandonment of hoarding, the practice of credit, the decrease in the importance of landed wealth. All these factors tend to make theft seem no more scandalous to people than confidence tricks or tax evasion. Interviewer: there has also been another change. In discourses about crime, the straightforward condemnation of the 19th century, he steals because he is evil, has given way to explanation. He steals because he is poor, and also to the attitude that it is worse to steal when one is rich than when one is poor. Foucault: true. If that were all, perhaps one could feel confident and hopeful. But along with that, isn't there an explanatory discourse that involves a number of dangers? He steals because he is poor, certainly, but we all know that all poor people don't steal. So for this individual to steal, there has to be something wrong with him. And this is his character, his psyche, his upbringing, his unconscious, his desires. And with that, the delinquent is handed over either to the penal technology of the prison or the medical technology, if not of the asylum, then of specialized supervision. Interviewer: the link you established between penal and medical techniques and modes of repression may upset some people. Foucault: well, maybe 15 years ago it was still scandalous to say things like that. I've noticed that even today the psychiatrists still have not forgiven me for madness in civilization. Not a fortnight ago I received yet another abusive letter. But I think today this sort of analysis is much more readily accepted, whatever offense it may still give, above all, to the psychiatrists who have been dragging their bad consciences around for so long. Interviewer: you show that the medical system has always served as an auxiliary to the penal system, even today when the psychiatrist collaborates with the judge, the court, and the prison. But perhaps this is unjust to some of the younger doctors who have tried to free themselves from this complicity. Foucault: perhaps. Anyway, I was only trying to mark out a few paths in discipline and punish. At the moment, I'm preparing a work on the role of psychiatric experts in penal matters. I intend to publish some dossiers, of which some go back to the 19th century, but others are more contemporary and are quite stupefying. Interviewer: you distinguish between two sorts of criminality, one which ends up in the police and the other which lapses into aesthetics. Vidocq and Lacenaire. Foucault: I ended my analysis with these crucial years, the 1840s. It was then that the long cohabitation of the police and criminality began. The first assessments have been drawn up of the failure of the prison. People knew that it didn't reform, but on the contrary manufactured criminals and criminality. And this was the moment when the benefits accrued from this process of production were also discovered. Criminals can be put to good use, if only to keep other criminals under surveillance. Vidocq is very characteristic of this. He came out of the 18th century and the revolutionary and imperial periods, in which he was for a while a smuggler, a pimp, and then a deserter. He was one of those nomads who circulated through towns, the country, and the army. It was the old style of criminality. Then he became absorbed into the system. Sent to forced labor, he emerged as an informer, became a policeman, and ended up as head of a detective force. And on a symbolic level, he is the first great criminal to have been used as a criminal by the apparatus of power. As for Lacenaire, he is the token of another phenomenon different from but related to the first, that of the aesthetic or literary interest beginning to be felt in crime. The aesthetic cult of crime. Until the 18th century, crimes were only celebrated in two modes. a literary mode when and because they were the crimes of a king, and a popular mode found in the broadsheets which narrate the exploits of Mondron or some great murderer. There are these two completely separate genres. Then around 1840, there appears the figure of the criminal hero who is a hero because he is a criminal and is neither aristocratic nor plebeian. The bourgeoisie begins to produce its own criminal heroes. This is at the same moment when the separation is effected between criminals and the popular classes. The criminal cannot be allowed to be a popular hero. He must be an enemy of the poor. The bourgeoisie constitutes for itself an aesthetic in which crime no longer belongs to the people, but is one of those fine arts of which the bourgeoisie alone is capable. Lacenaire is the model of this new kind of criminal. True, his parents have been guilty of certain misdeeds, but he has been properly brought up, has been to school, and has learned to read and write. This enables him to act as a leader in his milieu. The way he talks about other criminals is typical. They are brutal animals, cowards, and incompetents. He, Lacenaire, is the cold, lucid brain. Thus, the new hero is created, displaying all the signs and tokens of the bourgeoisie. That leads us in turn to Gaboriau and the detective story, in which the criminal is always of bourgeois origins. You never find a working-class hero in 19th century detective novels. The criminal is always intelligent, playing a sort of game on equal terms with the police. What is funny is that in reality, Lacenaire was pathetic, ridiculous, and inept. He always dreamed of killing, but never got as far as doing it. The one thing he could do was blackmail the homosexuals he picked up in the Bois de Boulogne. The only real crime he committed was a bit of dirty business with a little old man in prison. If Lacenaire came within a hair's breadth of being killed by his fellow forced labor convicts, it was because they thought, no doubt with good reason, that he was an informer. Interviewer: when you say criminals are useful, couldn't it be argued that many people view crime more as part of the nature of things than as a politico-economic necessity? It might appear that for an industrial society, criminals are a less socially useful resource than working-class labor power. Foucault: in the 1840s, unemployment and short-time working were fixed economic conditions. There was a surplus of labor power. But to think that crime was part of the order of things was part of the cynical intelligence of 19th century bourgeois thought. One had to be as naive as Baudelaire to think that the bourgeoisie is stupid or prudish. Rather, it is intelligent and cynical. You only need to read what it said about itself, and better still, what it said about others. At the end of the 18th century, people dreamed of a society without crime, and then the dream evaporated. Crime was too useful for them to dream of anything as crazy or ultimately as dangerous as a society without crime. No crime means no police. What makes the presence and control of the police tolerable for the population, if not fear of the criminal? This institution of the police, which is so recent and so oppressive, is only justified by that fear. If we accept the presence in our midst of these uniformed men, who have the exclusive right to carry arms, who demand our papers, who come and prowl on our doorsteps, how would any of this be possible if there were no criminals? And if there weren't articles every day in the newspapers telling us how numerous and dangerous our criminals are? Interviewer: you are very hard on criminology. It's garrulous discourse, it's endless repetitions. Foucault: have you ever read any criminological texts? They are staggering, and I say this out of astonishment, not aggressiveness, because I fail to comprehend how the discourse of criminology has been able to go on at this level. One has the impression that it is of such utility, is needed so urgently and rendered so vital for the working of the system, that it does not even need to seek a theoretical justification for itself, or even simply a coherent framework. It is entirely utilitarian. I think one needs to investigate why such a learned discourse became so indispensable to the functioning of the 19th century penal system. What made it necessary was the alibi, employed since the 18th century, that if one imposes a penalty on somebody, this is not in order to punish what he has done, but to transform what he is. From this point, a penal judgment, in other words, saying to someone we'll cut off your head or put you in prison or just fine you because you have done this or that, is an act which no longer has any meaning. Once you suppress the idea of vengeance, which previously was the act of a sovereign threatened in his very sovereignty by the crime, punishment can only have a meaning within the technology of reform. And judges themselves have gradually made the shift without wanting to and without even taking cognizance of the fact, from a verdict which still retained punitive connotations to one which they cannot justify in their own vocabulary except on the conditions of its being transformatory of the person condemned. Yet they know perfectly well that the instruments available to them, the death penalty, formerly the penal colonies, today imprisonment, don't transform anyone. Hence there is the necessity to call on those who produce a discourse on crime and criminals which will justify the measures in question. Interviewer: in short, criminological discourse is only useful for giving judges a semblance of good conscience? Foucault: yes, or rather it is indispensable in enabling them to judge. Interviewer: in your book on Pierre Rivière, it is a criminal who does the speaking and writing, but unlike Lacenaire, he carries his crime through to the end. First of all, how did you come upon this astonishing text? Foucault: by chance, while systematically working through penal reports by medico-legal and psychiatric experts published in professional journals of the 19th and 20th centuries. Interviewer: isn't it extremely rare for an illiterate or barely literate peasant to take the trouble to write 40 pages narrating and explaining his crime? Foucault: it's a totally strange story. It can, however, be said, and this is what struck me, that in such circumstances writing one's life story, one's recollections and experiences, was a practice found in a fair number of cases, and particularly in the prisons. Someone called Appert, one of the first philanthropists to visit a large number of penal colonies and prisons, got some prisoners to write their memoirs and subsequently published some fragments of these. In America, one also finds judges and doctors doing this. It was the first great burst of curiosity about the individuals whom it was desired to transform, and for the sake of whose transformation it was necessary to acquire a certain savoir, a certain technique. This curiosity about the criminal certainly did not exist in the 18th century, when it was simply a matter of knowing whether the person accused had really done what he was accused of. Once that was established, the tariff was fixed. The question, what is this individual who has committed this crime, is a new question, but this does not suffice for explaining the story of Pierre Rivière, because Rivière makes it clear that he had tried to begin writing his memoir even before committing his crime. In this book, we didn't want to conduct any kind of analysis of Rivière, whether psychological, psychoanalytical, or linguistic, but rather to render visible the medical and juridical mechanisms that surrounded the story. The rest we leave to the psychoanalysts and criminologists. But what is astonishing is that this text, which left the experts silent at the time, has struck them equally dumb today. Interviewer: I came across a sentence in Madness and Civilization where you say that we must free historical chronologies and successive orderings from all forms of progressivist perspective. Foucault: this is something I owe to the historians of science. I adopt the methodical precaution and the radical but unaggressive skepticism which makes it a principle not to regard the point in time where we are now standing as the outcome of a teleological progression which it would be one's business to reconstruct historically. That skepticism regarding ourselves and what we are here and now, which prevents one from assuming that what we have is better than or more than in the past. This doesn't mean not attempting to reconstruct generative processes, but that we must do this without imposing on them a positivity or a valorization. Interviewer: even though science has long shared the postulate that man progresses? Foucault: it isn't science that says that, but rather the history of science, and I don't say that humanity doesn't progress. I say that it is a bad method to pose the problem as, how is it that we have progressed? The problem is, how do things happen? And what happens now is not necessarily better or more advanced or better understood than what happened in the past. Interviewer: your researches bear on things that are banal, or which have been made banal because they aren't seen. For instance, I find it striking that prisons are in cities and yet no one sees them. Or else if one sees one wonders vaguely whether it's a prison, a school, a barracks, or a hospital. Your book is an important event because it places before our eyes something that no one was previously able to see. This can in a sense be said as much of certain other very detailed recent studies, such as one made of the peasantry and the fiscal system in the Bas-Languedoc during 1880 to 82, as of your study of a capital phenomenon like the prison which no one had looked at. Foucault: in a sense, that is how history has always been studied. The making visible of what was previously unseen can sometimes be the effect of using a magnifying instrument. Instead of studying monarchical institutions from the 16th to the end of the 18th century, one can study exhaustively the institution of the Conseil d'Anneau, from the death of Henri IV to the accession of Louis VIII. It's still the same domain of objects, but the object has been magnified. But to make visible the unseen can also mean a change of level, addressing oneself to a layer of material which had hitherto had no pertinence for history, and which had not been recognized as having any moral, aesthetic, political, or historical value. Today it's self-evident that methods of treating the insane form part of the history of reason, but this wasn't self-evident 50 years ago, when the history of reason met Plato, Descartes, and Kant, or Archimedes, Galileo, and Newton. Interviewer: but in your history of madness, there was still a sort of mirror play, a simple antinomy between reason and unreason, which is absent when you now write, histories are written of the congenitally blind, of wolf children, and of hypnosis. But who will write the history of the practice of examination, a history more general, more indefinite, but more determinate as well? For in this simple technique there is involved a whole domain of knowledge and a whole species of power. Foucault: mechanisms of power in general have never been much studied by history. History has studied those who held power, anecdotal histories of kings and generals. Contrasted with this, there has been the history of economic processes and infrastructures. Again, distinct from this, we have had histories of institutions, of what has been viewed as a superstructural level in relation to the economy. But power in its strategies, and one's general and detailed, and its mechanisms has never been studied. What has been studied even less is the relation between power and knowledge, the articulation of each on the other. It has been a tradition for humanism to assume that once someone gains power, he ceases to know. Power makes men mad, and those who govern are blind. Only those who keep their distance from power, who are in no way implicated in tyranny, shut up in their Cartesian poil, their room, their meditations, only they can discover the truth. Now I have been trying to make visible the constant articulation I think there is of power on knowledge and of knowledge on power. We should not be content to say that power has a need for such and such a discovery, such and such a form of knowledge, but we should add that the exercise of power itself creates and causes to emerge new objects of knowledge and accumulates new bodies of information. One can understand nothing about economic science if one does not know how power and economic power are exercised in everyday life. The exercise of power perpetually creates knowledge, and conversely, knowledge constantly induces effects of power. The university hierarchy is only the most visible, the most sclerotic, and least dangerous form of this phenomenon. One has to be really naive to imagine that the effects of power linked to knowledge have their culmination in university hierarchies. Diffused, entrenched, and dangerous, they operate in other places than in the person of the old professor. Modern humanism is therefore mistaken in drawing this line between knowledge and power. Knowledge and power are integrated with one another, and there is no point in dreaming of a time when knowledge will cease to depend on power. This is just a way of reviving humanism in a utopian guise. It is not possible for power to be exercised without knowledge. It is impossible for knowledge not to engender power. Liberate scientific research from the demands of monopoly capitalism. Maybe it's a good slogan, but it will never be more than a slogan. Interviewer: You seem to have kept your distance from Marx and Marxism. This was a reproach that was being addressed to you already about the archaeology of knowledge. Foucault: No doubt, but there is also a sort of game that I play with this. I often quote concepts, texts, and phrases from Marx, but without feeling obliged to add the authenticating label of a footnote with a laudatory phrase to accompany the quotation. As long as one does that, one is regarded as someone who knows and reveres Marx, and will be suitably honored in the so-called Marxist journals. But I quote Marx without saying so, without quotation marks, and because people are incapable of recognizing Marxist texts, I am thought to be someone who doesn't quote Marx. When a physicist writes a work of physics, does he feel it necessary to quote Newton and Einstein? He uses them, but he doesn't need the quotation marks, the footnote, and the eulogistic comment to prove how completely he is being faithful to the master's thought. And because other physicists know what Einstein did, what he discovered and proved, they can recognize him in what the physicist writes. It is impossible at the present time to write history without using a whole range of concepts directly or indirectly linked to Marxist thought, and situating oneself within a horizon of thought which has been defined and described by Marx. One might even wonder what difference there could ultimately be between being a historian and being a Marxist. Interviewer: So you would regard the term Marxist historian as a pleonasm, as the film critic Ostruch said about American cinema? Foucault: More or less, and it's within this general horizon of thought defined and coded by Marx that the discussion must take its starting point with those who call themselves Marxists because they play a game whose rules aren't Marxist but communistological. In other words, defined by communist parties who decide how you must use Marx so as to be declared by them to be a Marxist. Interviewer: What about Nietzsche? It seems to me that his presence, diffuse but growing, has finally come to figure in contemporary thought over the last 10 years or so as an opposition to the hegemony of Marx. Foucault: Nowadays, I prefer to remain silent about Nietzsche. When I was teaching philosophy, I often used to lecture on Nietzsche, but I wouldn't do that anymore today. If I wanted to be pretentious, I would use the genealogy of morals as the general title of what I am doing. It was Nietzsche who specified the power relation as the general focus, shall we say, of philosophical discourse, whereas for Marx it was the production relation. Nietzsche is the philosopher of power, a philosopher who managed to think of power without having to confine himself within a political theory in order to do so. Nietzsche's contemporary presence is increasingly important, but I am tired of people studying him only to produce the same kind of commentaries that are written on Hegel or Mallarmé. For myself, I prefer to utilize the writers I like. The only valid tribute to thought such as Nietzsche's is precisely to use it, to deform it, to make it groan in protest. And if commentators then say that I am being faithful or unfaithful to Nietzsche, that is of absolutely no interest. 3. Body power. Interviewers. Editorial collective of Quelcourt. You depict and discipline and punish a political system where the king's body plays an essential role. Foucault: In a society like that of the 17th century, the king's body wasn't a metaphor but a political reality. Its physical presence was necessary for the functioning of the monarchy. Interviewer: And what about the republic, one and indivisible? Foucault: That's a formula that was imposed against the Girondins, and the idea of an American-style federalism, but it never operated in the same manner as the king's body under the monarchy. On the contrary, it's the body of society which becomes the new principle in the 19th century. Social body which needs to be protected in a quasi-medical sense. In place of the rituals that serve to restore the corporal integrity of the monarch, remedies and therapeutic devices are employed such as the segregation of the sick, the monitoring of contagions, the exclusion of delinquents, the elimination of hostile elements by the supplice, Public torture and execution is thus replaced by the method of asepsis, criminology, eugenics, and the quarantining of degenerates. Interviewer: is there a fantasy body corresponding to different types of institution? Foucault: I believe the great fantasy is the idea of a social body constituted by the universality of wills. Now, the phenomenon of the social body is the effect not of a consensus, but of the materiality of power operating on the very bodies of individuals. Interviewer: the 18th century is usually seen under the aspect of liberation. You describe it as the period when a network of forms of control, quadrillage, is set in place. Is the liberation possible without the quadrillage? Foucault: as always with relations of power, one is faced with complex phenomena which don't obey the Hegelian form of the dialectic. Mastery and awareness of one's own body can be acquired only through the effect of an investment of power in the body. Gymnastics, exercises, muscle building, nudism, glorification of the body beautiful. All of this belongs to the pathway leading to the desire of one's own body, by way of the insistent, persistent, meticulous work of power on the bodies of children or soldiers, the healthy bodies. But once power produces this effect, there inevitably emerge the responding claims and affirmations, those of one's own body against power, of health against the economic system, of pleasure against the moral norms of sexuality, marriage, decency. Suddenly, what had made power strong becomes used to attack it. Power, after investing itself in the body, finds itself exposed to a counterattack in that same body. Do you recall the panic of the institutions of the social body, the doctors and politicians, at the idea of non-legalized cohabitation, l'union libre, or free abortion? But the impression that power weakens and vacillates here is in fact mistaken. Power can retreat here, reorganize its forces, invest itself elsewhere, and so the battle continues. Interviewer: would this account for the much discussed recuperation of the body through pornography and advertising? Foucault: I don't agree at all with this talk about recuperation. What's taking place is the usual strategic development of a struggle. Let's take a precise example, that of autoeroticism. The restrictions on masturbation hardly start in Europe until the 18th century. Suddenly a panic theme appears, an appalling sickness develops in the Western world. Children masturbate. Via the medium of families, though not at their initiative, a system of control of sexuality, an objectivization of sexuality allied to corporal persecution, is established over the bodies of children. But sexuality, through thus becoming an object of analysis and concern, surveillance and control, engenders at the same time an intensification of each individual's desire for, in, and over his body. The body thus became the issue of a conflict between parents and children, the child, and the instances of control. The revolt of the sexual body is the reverse effect of this encroachment. What is the response on the side of power? An economic and perhaps also ideological exploitation of eroticization from suntan products to pornographic films. Responding precisely to the revolt of the body, we find a new mode of investment which presents itself no longer in the form of control by repression, but that of control by stimulation. Get undressed, but be slim, good-looking, tanned. For each move by one adversary, there is an answering one by the other. But this isn't a recuperation in the leftist sense. One has to recognize the indefiniteness of the struggle, though this is not to say it won't someday have an end. Interviewer: doesn't a new revolutionary strategy for taking power have to proceed via a new definition of the politics of the body? Foucault: the emergence of the problem of the body and its growing urgency have come about through the unfolding of a political struggle. Whether this is a revolutionary struggle, I don't know. Or one can say that what has happened since 1968, and arguably what made 1968 possible, is something profoundly anti-Marxist. How can European revolutionary movements free themselves from the Marx effect, the institutions typical of 19th and 20th century Marxism? This was the direction of the questions posed by 68, and this calling in question of the equation Marxism equals the revolutionary process, an equation that constituted a kind of dogma, the importance given to the body is one of the important, if not essential, elements. Interviewer: what course is the evolution of the bodily relationship between the masses and the state apparatus taking? Foucault: first of all, one must set aside the widely held thesis that power in our bourgeois capitalist societies has denied the reality of the body in favor of the soul, consciousness, ideality. In fact, nothing is more material, physical, corporal than the exercise of power. What mode of investment of the body is necessary and adequate for the functioning of a capitalist society like ours? From the 18th to the early 20th century, I think it was believed that the investment of the body by power had to be heavy, ponderous, meticulous, and constant. Hence those formidable disciplinary regimes in the schools, hospitals, barracks, factories, cities, lodgings, families. And then, starting in the 1960s, it began to be realized that such a cumbersome form of power was no longer as indispensable as had been thought, and that industrial societies could content themselves with a much looser form of power over the body. Then it was discovered that control of sexuality could be attenuated and given new forms. One needs to study what kind of body the current society needs. Interviewer: would you distinguish your interest in the body from that of other contemporary interpretations? Foucault: I think I would distinguish myself from both the Marxist and the para-Marxist perspectives. As regards Marxism, I am not one of those who try to elicit the effects of power at the level of ideology. Indeed, I wonder whether, before one poses the question of ideology, it wouldn't be more materialist to study first the question of the body and the effects of power on it. Because what troubles me with these analyses which prioritize ideology is that there is always presupposed a human subject on the lines of the model provided by classical philosophy, endowed with a consciousness which power is then thought to seize on. Interviewer: but the Marxist perspective does include an awareness of the effect of power on the body in the working situation. Foucault: certainly. But whereas today political and economic demands are coming to be made more on behalf of the wage earner's body than of the wage earning class, one seldom hears the former being discussed as such. It's as though revolutionary discourses were still steeped in the ritualistic themes derived from Marxist analyses. And while there are some very interesting things about the body in Marx's writings, Marxism considered as an historical reality has had a terrible tendency to occlude the question of the body in favor of consciousness and ideology. I would also distinguish myself from para-Marxists like Marcuse who give the notion of repression an exaggerated role, because power would be a fragile thing if its only functions were to repress, if it worked only through the mode of censorship, exclusion, blockage and repression, in the manner of a great superego, exercising itself only in a negative way. If, on the contrary, power is strong, this is because, as we are beginning to realize, it produces effects at the level of desire, and also at the level of knowledge. Far from preventing knowledge, power produces it. If it has been possible to constitute a knowledge of the body, this has been by way of an ensemble of military and educational disciplines. It was on the basis of power over the body that a physiological, organic knowledge of it became possible. The fact that power is so deeply rooted and the difficulty of eluding its embrace are effects of all these connections. This is why the notion of repression, which mechanisms of power are generally reduced to, strikes me as very inadequate and possibly dangerous. Interviewer: Your study is concentrated on all these micro powers that are exercised at the level of daily life. Aren't you neglecting the state apparatus here? Foucault. It's true that since the late 19th century, Marxist and Marxized revolutionary movements have given special importance to the state apparatus as the stake of their struggle. What were the ultimate consequences of this? In order to be able to fight a state which is more than just a government, the revolutionary movement must possess equivalent politico-military forces and hence must constitute itself as a party, organized internally in the same way as a state apparatus with the same mechanisms of hierarchies and organization of powers. This consequence is heavy with significance. Secondly, there is the question much discussed within Marxism itself of the capture of the state apparatus. Should this be considered as a straightforward takeover accompanied by appropriate modifications, or should it be the opportunity for the destruction of that apparatus? You know how the issue was finally settled. The state apparatus must be undermined, but not completely undermined, since the class struggle will not be brought to an immediate end with the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hence the state apparatus must be kept sufficiently intact for it to be employed against the class enemy. So we reach a second consequence. During the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the state apparatus must to some extent at least be maintained. Finally then, as a third consequence, in order to operate these state apparatuses which have been taken over but not destroyed, it will be necessary to have recourse to technicians and specialists. And in order to do this, one has to call upon the old class which is acquainted with the apparatus, namely the bourgeoisie. This clearly is what happened in the USSR. I don't claim at all that the state apparatus is unimportant, but it seems to me that among all the conditions for avoiding a repetition of the Soviet experience and preventing the revolutionary process from running into the ground, one of the first things that has to be understood is that power isn't localized in the state apparatus, and that nothing in society will be changed if the mechanisms of power that function outside, below, and alongside the state apparatuses on a much more minute and everyday level are not also changed. Interviewer. Could we now turn then to the human sciences and psychoanalysis in particular? Foucault. The case of psychoanalysis is indeed an interesting one. Psychoanalysis was established in opposition to a certain kind of psychiatry, the psychiatry of degeneracy, eugenics, and heredity. This practice in theory, represented in France by Magnon, acted as the great foil to psychoanalysis. Indeed, in relation to that psychiatry, which is still the psychiatry of today's psychiatrists, psychoanalysis played a liberating role. Moreover, in certain countries, I am thinking of Brazil in particular, it has played a political role, denouncing the complicity of psychiatrists with political power. Again, take what is happening in the Eastern countries. The people there who take an interest in psychoanalysis are not the most disciplined among the psychiatrists. But the fact remains that in our societies the career of psychoanalysis has taken other directions and has been the object of different investments. Certain of its activities have effects which fall within the function of control and normalization. If one can succeed in modifying these relationships of power into which psychoanalysis enters and rendering unacceptable the effects of power they propagate, this will render the functioning of the state apparatuses much more difficult. Another advantage of conducting a critique of relations existing at a minute level would be to render impossible the reproduction of the form of the state apparatus within revolutionary movements. Interviewer. Your studies of madness in the prisons enable us to retrace the constitution of an ever more disciplinary form of society. This historical process seems to follow an almost inexorable logic. Foucault. I have attempted to analyze how at the initial stages of industrial societies, a particular punitive apparatus was set up together with a system for separating the normal and the abnormal. To follow this up, it will be necessary to construct a history of what happens in the 19th century and how the present highly complex relation of forces, the current outline of the battle, has been arrived at through a succession of offensives and counteroffensives, effects and counter-effects. The coherence of such a history does not derive from the revelation of a project but from a logic of opposing strategies. The archaeology of the human sciences has to be established through studying the mechanisms of power which have invested human bodies, acts, and forms of behavior, and this investigation enables us to rediscover one of the conditions of the emergence of the human sciences. The great 19th century effort in discipline and normalization. Freud was well aware of all this. He was aware of the superior strength of his position on the matter of normalization. So why the sacralizing modesty, pudeur, that insists on denying that psychoanalysis has anything to do with normalization? Interviewer: how do you see the intellectual's role in militant practice? Foucault: the intellectual no longer has to play the role of an advisor. The project, tactics, and goals to be adopted are a matter for those who do the fighting. What the intellectual can do is to provide instruments of analysis, and at present this is the historian's essential role. What's effectively needed is a ramified, penetrative perception of the present, one that makes it possible to locate lines of weakness, strong points, positions where the instances of power have secured and implanted themselves by a system of organization dating back over 150 years. In other words, a topological and geological survey of the battlefield. That is the intellectual's role. But as for saying, here is what you must do, certainly not. Interviewer: who or what is it that coordinates the activities of agents of the political body? Foucault: this is an extremely complex system of relations which leads one finally to wonder how, given that no one person can have conceived it in its entirety, it can be so subtle in its distribution, its mechanisms, reciprocal controls, and adjustments. It's a highly intricate mosaic. During certain periods there appear agents of liaison. Take the example of philanthropy in the early 19th century. People appear who make it their business to involve themselves in other people's lives, health, nutrition, housing. Then out of this confused set of functions there emerge certain personages, institutions, forms of knowledge, public hygiene, inspectors, social workers, psychologists. And we are now seeing a whole proliferation of different categories of social work. Naturally, it's medicine which has played the basic role as the common denominator. Its discourse circulated from one instance to the next. It was in the name of medicine both that people came to inspect the layout of houses and equally that they classified individuals as insane, criminal, or sick. But there also emerged out of the confused matrix of philanthropy a highly diverse mosaic comprising all these social workers. The interesting thing is to ascertain not what overall project presides over all these developments, but how in terms of strategy the different pieces were set in place. June 1975.